First of all, I want to tell you that today is day 5,409 that Boswell has been here and been in business. Much obliged. And I want to thank our co-host for this evening, Community Advocates Public Policy Institute. And I want to give Carrie a moment from Community Advocates to say a few things about the program. So Carrie, please.
Thank you, Chris. Well, good evening, everyone. As Chris mentioned, my name is Carrie Southern. I'm the Deputy Director of the Community Advocates Public Policy Institute. I want to thank you for coming tonight to hear from two very acclaimed authors. Ben Austen is the author of Correction, Parole, Prison, and the Possibility of Change. And Elly Fishman is the author of Refugee High, Coming of Age in America. I also want to thank Daniel and his fabulous team here at Boswell for inviting us to partner on this evening devoted to discussing these important topics. Community advocates, along with many stakeholders in the community, have been working for years to make it easier for returning citizens to be successful in the community, both in their career paths and in their personal lives, to reduce their chances of being incarcerated again. Many of you stakeholders are here tonight, and I want to thank you for your dedication and creativity in a challenging environment. As Ben explains in his book today, the country spends twice as much on crime and punishment as it does on social services. Think of what our country could look like if more investments were made in social services rather than locking people up for such extreme lengths of time. Thank you, Ben and Elly, and I look forward to the discussion this evening. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks so much, Carrie. Yes, thanks again to our spectacular co-host. So I'm just going to kind of round out the introduction here. I'm the introduction rounder. First of all, as mentioned, our conversational partner this evening is Elly Fishman, teaches at UW, of course, and is author of Refugee High, another wonderful book. And she is going to be interviewing and questioning Ben Austen, author of High Risers. He's been an editor at Harper's. He's co-host of the podcast Some of My Best Friends Are, and you can fill in the title of your own risk of putting your foot in your mouth. His writings appeared in the New York Times, GQ, Wired, among many other things. And of course, as you probably know by now, he's here with Correction, Parole, Prison, and the Possibility of Change. Matthew Desmond, yes, evicted Matthew Desmond, Pulitzer Matthew Desmond. That Matthew Desmond says of the book, Correction ranks among the very best books on life inside and outside of prison I've ever read. So please give them both a warm welcome.
Okay.
Hi, everybody.
Hey.
So fun to be here. What an amazing turnout on this slushy, cold day. Ben, it's so exciting to be up here with you.
Yeah.
I thought maybe you could start off with a reading from the book, if you don't mind, and then we can dive in.
I don't mind at all. I want to thank you for doing this. Elly and I are actually meeting for the first time tonight, although I blurbed your book.
He did.
And we are sort of from the same neighborhood in Chicago, on the south side of Chicago. And I want to thank the bookstore. I love this bookstore. I really do. Carrie from Community Advocates, thank you. Thank you for organizing and supporting this event, and also for all the work you do. It is sort of on the ground of what I'm writing about. So thank you. Am I getting feedback? Is that?
I'm hearing something.
Yeah.
One of us.
And thank all of you for coming out tonight. It's not the greatest weather. I drove from Chicago, so I went further, but so I'm going to read a short section. The book is in a big way about our criminal justice system and about our country and about our values. In a smaller way, it's about two people who spent half a century in prison each, and their saga to try to get out on parole. And one of them is named Michael Henderson. He's from Southern Illinois, and he went to prison as an 18-year-old. He, as a teenager, shot another kid. And for that decision, he was sentenced what's called an indeterminate sentence of like 200 years, but meaning he could also come up for parole every every so often after the 10-year mark. And this is a passage from pretty early on in his incarceration at about the 10-year mark. Michael quit yoga, but he was hooked on the idea of self-improvement. He gave up cigarettes mainly because he was sick of supporting other guys' habits. Man, can you spare a square? He replaced nicotine with weed. He'd been doing cocaine and heroin in prison when he could get it. He didn't think he'd formed a habit, but by his mid-30s, his body felt filled with wet sand. His muscles rebelled against action. He was weighted down by a lethargy that wouldn't clear. Michael was transferred to Mount Sterling in Western Illinois, a prison whose population equaled that of the entire surrounding city. The concrete yard was about a quarter mile around. One morning, Michael attempted to jog it. Before he'd made it once around the perimeter, he was doubled over, his arms pinioned to his legs, his lungs convulsed, unable to pull in air. When he recovered enough to contemplate his bodily deterioration, what Michael felt was disgust. He wouldn't make it to 50 at this rate. He decided to make running a part of his daily routine. He began by walking the yard. Soon he was mixing in short jogs. He built up his stamina, willing himself to continue. Michael liked that he could mark his progress. Once around without stopping. 4 laps, a milestone. At Mount Sterling, the men were allowed a total of 2.5 hours of yard a day. Guys gathered around the weight pile or huddled together in small groups. A few men jogged, and Michael noted the first time he passed each of them. He learned how to steady his breathing. He lengthened his stride, his muscles hardened. The fog in his head lifted. Michael still smoked weed, but the stronger stuff he no longer craved. He ran farther, upping his pace. Michael could eventually run for 10 miles or even more. When he wore out his shoes, he bought new ones at the commissary. As the prison population grew, the yard was partitioned in half, and Michael was forced to run in ever tighter circles. During the winters, wind and snow barreled in off the Midwestern plains. Michael didn't stop. I am the rain. I am the snow. I coexist with the universe, he liked to tell himself. If he missed a day or two, he fiended for the exercise. An irritation grew inside of him. He craved the control that running provided, the release. A few miles into a run, as fatigue set in, he commanded his body to obey. Shut up, do what you're told, he'd yell out. The mind is the master. He'd continue running, passing beyond the pain. He could get to a point where his body felt like it barely existed. And then he could imagine himself elsewhere. He was a passenger in the airplane passing overhead. He was driving in the car speeding along the highway. He was back home. Running saved my life, he would say. I began to see all this power over my own destiny, regardless of what they do at that parole board.
I wish I had like a fraction of his grit when I'm going out for a run. And it also reminded me of like how it felt like to write a book at times when you're just so deep in it and you just have to keep going. We were talking about that, a book becomes something that you have to return to year after year, just buckle down and do it. So I'm curious, could you tell us a little bit about what brought you to this particular book and this topic of parole?
Yeah, thank you. My previous book was a book about Cabrini Green, which is a public housing complex in Chicago. And when I finished it, this was 2018, someone reached out to me and said, there's a person you mentioned in the book who is convicted of a crime that happened in 1970. And that person is still in prison and he's about to come up for parole again. And the truth is, I wrote all about this crime in 1970 because it was devastating for the community and for the city. It was one of these sensational cases. 2 police officers are assassinated. And at the end of that era of sort of unrest and sort of all the changes that are going on in the city and the country, it really sort of carried this kind of symbolic weight as well as just the sheer tragedy of it. And so I wrote about the changes. I never thought to interview that guy. I never thought to interview Johnny Veal, who was convicted of this crime. It didn't really cross my mind that a teenager in 1970 would still be sitting in a cell 50 years later. And so I had to interrogate myself about that. Which is also sort of that those 50 years are the 50 years of mass incarceration of that era, which starts basically in 1973. And then also I had to ask myself, the guy said that Johnny Veal was innocent, and I had to ask myself how much that mattered and sort of thinking about a 50-year sentence. And then I also started thinking like parole. What's up with parole? Like, that's interesting. Like, maybe some of you have seen the Shawshank Redemption, or, which is kind of the most iconic scene of parole. But like, I was like, I've been writing about criminal justice and the criminal justice system and mass incarceration and other things. And I was like, I can imagine it. So I started going to parole hearings, and I went the first time. I drove to Springfield, the capital, where they're held once a month. And it was transfixing. It was like all storytelling. And so we're both storytellers, and you're like, it was this contest of who could tell a better story, of a story of the original crime, which is always in a contest, it's way, way in the lead. It's always the one that's the most important. But then other stories that are like underdogs, a story of redemption, a story of growing old and being a different person, a story of innocence being the hardest one to tell. And so I was suddenly inside of this world. And I also realized that at the back end of the criminal system, parole really told the story of everything that came before it. You sit there and they're thinking about a crime, they're thinking about all this time in prison, and then they're thinking about this fundamental question, which most of us actually don't ask, which is like, what's the point of punishment? We lock up 1 in 4 people of all the incarcerated people in the world, and we don't really know, what we're hoping these prison sentences accomplish. And so I was in, that's where I was going to spend the next 4 years of my life working on this.
That's like I feel like as a journalist, you're always, one of the amazing things about being a journalist is you get to walk into rooms you might not otherwise think to go in or spend time in.
Yeah.
But a lot of the time, it doesn't turn into a book or a place where you spend 5 years of your life. And I wonder what that moment was just like for you when you walked into that room, and it sounded like it wasn't at all maybe what you were expecting.
Yeah. And you said this thing about a journalist, we often have this phrase, write what you know. And for us, it's like actually like write what you don't know, or like get to know it. That's the sort of a nonfiction writer, is like pursue this thing and like come to know it as much as you can, but start out like you get to have experiences which are not your own. And there were many rooms I walked into which didn't lead to books. That's part of, there's a lot of like trial and error and things that don't even become magazine stories. You spend months sometimes doing things. There was a moment in that first day of that first parole hearing where they just rejected everybody. And we can talk about this later, but Wisconsin and Illinois are 2 of 16 states that have gotten rid of parole for anybody. So the only people that come up for parole are before this law change. Here in Wisconsin, it was abolished in 2000, but in Illinois, it was 1978. So the only people who are coming up for parole are old as hell. They've spent, really 5 decades in prison at this point, and they're still all getting rejected. And at the end of it, the last case, they voted to free somebody. And it was so powerful to have witnessed this moment of like mercy happening, and to think of the limitations of this process, but also the possibilities, like something life-altering just occurred in front of me. And, the board members, who were all earnest and diligent in what they were doing, and have many of the same limitations that we all do. And we've all sort of, we're seeped in a world, in a country in which extremely long sentences are kind of the norm, and they're normalized. But they voted for this thing that happened. A person who had been in prison for 40-something years was going home. I was like, that's the moment. I was like, okay. And the other part is then I went to prison to meet Johnny Veal. And that kind of relationship, negotiation, dynamic also started to blossom and kind of move forward.
That's a great segue to my next question.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Well, one of the things I've always really admired about your writing is that you take topics that can be hard to look at and can be hard to get people to pay attention to and humanize them. I mean, like through human stories, and it's something I also try and do in my work, and I feel like it is an incredibly powerful tool, narrative in general. And in this book, you tell the stories of two men, Johnny Veal and Michael Henderson. And I'm wondering how you chose to follow these two men. Daniel and I were talking earlier, we're like, two's kind of an unusual number, you know, often it's one, maybe three. In my book, it was four, and I get, dragged on Goodreads for that. It's too many people,
many,
turns out. My next book will be one. But yeah, the following two have that decision, and then the choosing the men individually themselves.
Yeah. I mean, so Johnny, who also goes by Khalif, in a way, I explained it in the sense that he was the genesis of this, and I was still sort of unpacking this history. And he's also just extraordinary. The things he had accomplished over the past 30 years in prison, 30 years of a 50-year sentence. His first 20 years were pretty rough, but the last 30, which is just crazy to say. And so I was intrigued, and he was clearly sort of central to this. This is a little trick in the book, but I actually met Michael after he already made Parole.
Okay, I was going to ask you
And
that.
then I go back in the beginning and tell his story chronologically, but about halfway through the book, he gets out. So I was able to write a book that had one person whose attempts to get out are going to be the entire arc of the book, Johnny Veal. We don't know until the very end. It's building up to a case, a hearing. And the way that most of us think about parole, in fact, is to be out on parole, to meet with a parole officer, to be on the street. We sometimes, mix it up with something called mandatory supervised release, which is most people who leave prison can be supervised, or you can serve part of your sentence outside. That's different than being released by a parole board. But I was able to write then about what it means to be out, and all of the ways that our system works against people succeeding once they're out. So I was able to do both the efforts inside and actually come in before a board, and then what happens afterwards. So there's a funny thing when you said you had four. You meet a lot of people and you're thinking, what facet of the story does this tell? Are they willing to spend so much damn time with me? To recreate a scene. And this is true of any of us. If I asked you, who did you go to prom with, or something like that, high school prom, to really write that story, I would have to sit with you and ask all these sort of what might seem like arduous details, like, who else was there? Where were you standing? What was the car that you drove? Was it your car? Did you rent it? And then you're able to kind of construct something. It's so much time. So somebody has to be willing. Often there's something in it for them as well. I mean, for Johnny Veal, it was like, I want you to help me get out. I think telling this story will help me. And if I don't get out, then this story is the legacy of my life if I die in prison. At least there's something on paper. Michael I met, and he was telling his story at an event, and he was crying, and I went up to, as he told it, and I went up to him after. We just hit it off in a way. We enjoyed talking, and that made the process, as that's what makes the process work. There's some kind of collaborative thing that happens.
Well, you become part of each other's lives in a big way because of, when did you start reporting this book?
About the end of 2018.
Yeah, so it's a long
haul.
It's a long haul, and
Yeah.
you have to build a lot of trust. I also, I have some craft questions because I was going to ask you, at what point in their journey did you meet them? So it's so interesting that most of Michael's story, or much of it, is reconstructed Can you talk a little bit about your reporting process and how the kind of breakdown of what you're witnessing firsthand and
Yeah.
reconstructing? Of course, there's a lot of history in this book too, so a lot of research.
Yeah, yeah. And then really, I mean, I'm certainly the things with Michael on the outside, I'm witnessing. We're just spending time together. And the other thing that happens with people going through the criminal system, there's just so much documentation on them. There's so much story that's been accumulated over time. It might be slanted and not the whole story. You know, what did they call it the statement of facts, which is sort of, you know, where the state's idea of what's true and not lies, but that's the story that's been passed down from the court by, you know, the prosecution put together and has been passed down. It is, you know, enormous. There's so many details. There's so much story. Johnny Veal's trial transcript is 15,000 pages. You know, so all of that's, I read it, you know, but like all of that story, all of that material, all those details. I tracked down his lawyer from 1971. I went to his house. He had a welcome mat on the house at his front door that said, "Come back with a warrant." But he was very welcoming without it. But he had remembered this case because it was like the one that got away. He lost it, and he wanted to talk about it. And so I was able to corroborate these things. And then there's like the weird reporting of COVID, during the pandemic, where I'm stuck at home. Oh, here's this guy in prison who's stuck. We just talk, you know, every day. And like I had a list of questions. You know, so where were you in 1975 when you got stabbed at this prison? Who else was there? Were they in that gang? Were they in this gang? And we just went through, I mean, 100 phone calls and hundreds of recordings. And so that was part of it too. And then they're able to recreate some of the past.
It's a lot of work.
Yeah, it's a lot of work.
And you
It's,
can feel it in the book. I mean, it's so rich in detail, and you really feel like you're walking with these two men. And the other part of it is this enormous history of parole and mass incarceration that are, you know, as you say, tangled with each other in this country.
yeah.
I don't know how many people have already read the book, but I wonder if you could just give sort of a brief history of parole as a sort of broader context for the lives and the arcs of these two men in the book.
Yeah, I mean, we as a country came up with this notion of parole about 100 years ago, and it's very logical in a way. You know, if our prisons are actually correctional institutions, meaning they're supposed to correct people, then they're not just about punishment and warehousing folks. They're about rehabilitation. And so the thinking was a judge at trial couldn't actually know when in the future somebody would be rehabilitated. That's really logical, right? Like they're not fortune tellers. And so who might better know? Somebody, a group that could check in with these people and see how they're doing. When do you seem like, you know, you feel remorse or you've dealt with whatever demons got you sent to prison in the first place? When are you ready to return? And so that was the origin of parole. It was so logical. And this is during the progressive era, which we're actually thinking about a lot of ways to improve society, that it you know, it catches on everywhere. You know, it's adopted in every single state and by the federal government, the federal prison system. It fails in so many ways. You know, our prisons aren't really about rehabilitation. They're criminogenic. They create more criminal behavior than not. So that makes it pretty tough for parole to work. And the other thing that happens is, why trust these group of guys? You know, these people, you know, are they going to be fair? Are they biased? Are they racist? Are they sexist? Are they, you know, what if I don't speak the same language as them? And all these things that make it problematic. I'm going to come up for parole, and if you just keep on denying me, I might actually be here forever. And so in the 1970s, people in prison, people locked up as part of a prisoner rights movement, said, let's get rid of parole. This was their demand because they didn't trust the system. And it's then taken on by conservatives as well as a way to push harsher sentencing laws. Once sentencing laws get out of the hands of judges and parole boards and into politicians who are always under pressure to be tougher on crime and not to appear soft on crime, our sentences escalate. And this is really the start of the mass incarceration era, where more people are sent to prison for their offenses rather than alternatives, and for longer periods of time with fewer possibilities of release. In a way, that's the history. Illinois abolishes parole in 1978. The federal system does. 16 states, Wisconsin does. Wisconsin's the last one in 2000. Today, there are these efforts to bring it back. That people in prison who are leading these efforts are saying, sure, 50 years ago, we wanted to get rid of it, but we were wrong. What replaced it was much worse. And we want at least an opportunity now to get out. We had 200,000 people in prison in the entire country, all state and federal prisons in 1970, 1973. Today, we have 200,000 people who are serving life sentences or sentences so long that they're the same thing. So those 200,000 people are saying, well, at least I want a shot at some way to show that I'm not an 18-year-old kid now. I'm a 48-year-old man or woman, and I'm a completely different person. Like, at least acknowledge that, see me, hear me. And that sounded a little like Tommy. Sorry. Yeah, but a parole hearing is somewhere where you're literally seen and heard. And in some ways, there aren't that many opportunities for people serving extremely long sentences.
So, I mean, you follow these two men, but another kind of character in the book is the parole board itself. And you come to know in Illinois, the individual people who are on the board. Sounds like, I mean, it reads like you spent time with them and you got to know them as well. I wonder if what that experience was like. You know, one of the interesting things about being a journalist, I think, is, you know, you're often the only one having conversations with people on every side of the issue. And then you sort of have to go home and filter through it and think about it and stitch it all together. So yeah, talk to us a little bit about, you know, the other side, the parole board.
That's a great way to frame that question, and your point that we're not advocates necessarily. So we are looking at from all sides. And yeah, I spent a lot of time with these, you know, the board members, and there were no other journalists there. And they also gave me access. They said, you can come every month and you can record us. They're public hearings, but they could have said no. And to see how they think and talk and work and interact with one another. And then, you know, several of them then allowed me in their homes to sort of interview them further. You know, I'm very aware how difficult those decisions are within a broken system. What they're trying to do, you know, you could imagine this. They're trying to like decipher whether somebody is remorseful. Like, how do you do that? Like, what's truth that you hear? Who isn't going to come up for parole and say, I'm remorseful, right? Or, you know, when do you, what's truth? And is a better storyteller somebody who's convincing actually more reformed or less a danger than somebody who's inarticulate? Like, is that, but those are sort of the terms. And those are the terms that actually, you know, make parole really problematic, but are also fascinating. And then the board is made up of, by law in Illinois, it's half Republican, half Democrat. And there are a lot of former law enforcement on the board, and in almost every state. And they have their own biases. And then there are many people who are restorative justice practitioners. And to see them hashing out together some form of what's going to equal justice, that's really, you know, in the end of the day, it's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, there's, I witnessed something else, which is reporting this with the parole board before maybe 2 years ago. It really felt like we were in the midst of something transformative, and I happened to be witnessing it like close up firsthand. You know, we peaked out in our prison numbers in 2009 at 1.6 million, and it's been like slowly going down since. And usually, like, our extent of mercy sort of ends with nonviolent offenders or nonviolent drug offenders. But our numbers are about 400,000 down, which is pretty significant, but not, you know, still 1.2 million is crazy and an aberration historically here and in the world. But there was change happening. It felt like the consensus in our country was coming around to this idea that what we do is expensive and cruel and doesn't work in terms of keeping us safe. And so seeing this, and then the summer of George Floyd happens in 2020, and we start like a deep interrogation of things like, you know, these systems of punishment and enforcement. And it felt like change was happening, and this was the accelerant. And I could see firsthand at the board hearings them becoming more merciful, of just by numbers letting more people out. I could just watch it every month. And even the tough on crime, like former sheriffs, being kind of caught up in this. And then the midterm elections happened 2 years ago. And it's not just that all of that disappeared. It was like this, I had been studying things like 1970 and what happened after Attica prison riots, and sort of these moments of possibility right before mass incarceration gets going, and what happened in the 80s and 90s as we passed this, you know, enormous crime bill. The same like tired language, the empty rhetoric, that it still had traction in 2020 and 2021 was dispiriting, and kind of, you know, I wasn't witnessing, you know, I wasn't like firsthand on the front line witnessing. I was seeing this cycle continue, like this pendulum swinging. And we are not in a moment of pendulum swinging between, like, you know, modest reforms and like a little bit of backlash. We are so radically different than from what we've been. You know, like I said, we're at 200,000 for almost the whole 20th century. And then suddenly we're at, you know, 400, 600, a million, and now at 1.2 million. We're like this isn't normal what we're doing. And so it was a little heartbreaking. You know, I'm a pretty upbeat person and optimistic, and it felt like nationally, at least, like we weren't advancing.
And you're reporting and writing this book through that entire arc. When did you finish the draft of the book, out of curiosity?
20, maybe this beginning of 2022, something like that, right? At the beginning of 2023.
Okay, so
Yeah.
how did that impact where you felt like the book would sit and your own writing and reporting of it?
Yeah, I mean, you know this too, that books take so long that you think something happens in society and you're like, aha, this is the hook. I remember writing this first book, High Rises, about public housing, and Occupy Wall Street happened. I was like, all right, this is like this new thinking about social justice and about, you know, our social safety net and other things, and about inequality. And, you know, 5 years later, when I finished the book, no one even really remembers. And so, you know, that's always a good reminder, like to write something that in sort of encapsulates the history and the moment, but doesn't feel constrained by it, defined by it. I hope that succeeds, but also at the end to kind of reflect on this, reflect on what I just said, of like what I witnessed, and not knowing what's coming next, but thinking that this is also written of a certain moment, and to be transparent about that.
Well, I think rooting it in individual story that feel like, in a lot of ways, I mean, they exist out of time. And maybe some of that is also just being in prison for as long as they are. You know, you could encounter this story a year from now and 10 years from now and still have it sit and resonate in the same way. This is like kind of a Russian doll question. I don't exactly know how to frame it. So bear with me. But I mean, and you've already said this several times in this conversation, and it's a big part of what I took away from the book is the importance of how you tell your story when you're going up for parole, and whether you tell it well. And you see both men kind of try it different ways and get a lot of different coaching on how to repent and show remorse and show how they've changed. And you can feel kind of the potency of that, both as a storyteller and then who is receiving the story. And that's something that I also think about as a writer myself, you know, the story you're telling and how it's received in the world. And I just wonder, you know, writing about that and witnessing that, how you reflected on that as a journalist and a storyteller yourself.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that the first thing you made me think of is when Michael Henderson, who I read the part about, he's the one who was running, first started telling the story of his crime. He always spoke in passive voice. You know, my brother gave me a gun that day, and I just wanted to scare the guy, so I put it on the windowsill, and then it went off. not I shot this person, I shot the gun. And yeah, and so I also reflect on that in the book, that it's, there's a sense of how we tell stories that matter. And just even thinking about the passage that I read about Michael Henderson, which is me as storyteller, right? And Michael having told me a story, but then telling it to you guys. I want to tell that story that way, and I want that piece of his life to be known because, as you said right away, like you could relate to that. When I run, we all know what it's like to, and there's so much about what happens in prison that's opaque and purposefully so. They're far away. It's hard to communicate. We don't know, like we can say a word like a 50-year sentence, but we don't really think what it means, like to think of all those years. But to live a little with him and through the medium of storytelling, to live with him, to know what it was like to build up his endurance and to relate, to see him, to know that, also that he had a drug habit in there, drugs were available, to know what prison was like a little bit, to get that sense. He said something to me once that he said, there's something about this experience which you'll never understand. And I was like, I'm sure that's right, but tell me what you mean. And like, let me try, it's like that half a distance thing where you're always away. And I was like, let me just try to get a little bit closer. There are also ways, this is where I'm a little more pessimistic about what we do. Storytelling like this is not the fastest way to bring about change. If you're working for 4 years on something before anyone is going to see it in the world. And I actually had this come up because at the end of the book, what I write about when Johnny Veal is coming up for parole, the book wasn't out yet. And I was like, what am I doing? Like, I know more about this person now besides him than anyone else out here. And I know more about his case. I read all this thing. I know as much as his lawyers more. I know everything about where he came from. I wrote a book about the home where he grew up and where the crime happened. What am I doing with this book if it's not to be part of this moment in his life? And so I found a way to write something as an expert witness for his parole hearing, because the story couldn't just exist here at this moment years later. It had to have some resonance in the real time. And that's a kind of decision as a journalist too, right? Like, what do you want these stories to do?
Yeah, I noticed that, of course, towards the end of the book, suddenly, I think you're in there a little bit throughout, but definitely at the end in his hearing, you're suddenly on the page in a very present way that you haven't been the rest of the
book.
And
that's a decision we make, right? Like, and there's certain kind of writing, there's certainly the first person thing is sells. We could ask Daniel and others here, like, it sells more books. People like to, but you're not in your book, right? You're
never.
Yeah. So there's a way, like, do you write about yourself as a kind of invisible I, EYE, or are you? And there were moments when I suddenly had to realize, like, they're actually calling me out. The state's attorney then, calls me out and says, Ben Austen doesn't know what he's talking about. And so I was brought into the book in a way. And so there were a few moments, but it's not very much. You're right.
And then, of course, one of the things that I only learned when my book came out, which was my first book, is that you're then out in the world. You are part of the book, once it's actually in people's hands, even if you're not on the page. And then you're maybe in conversation with the folks you wrote about, or you become a voice that is braided with the stories in your book, which I don't know, for me, that was a new experience and something that I sort of am still thinking about.
Yeah, that's complicated. And as you said before, that you're connecting with people, and they're part of your life now, and you're part of theirs. And so that continues. One way that I've reckoned with it or is that I do as many events with the people who are in the book as possible. I'm there as kind of a contextualizer, but I told their stories at some point, but they're also present as much as possible to tell their stories right there. And that's been effective and for both parties.
So that brings me to my last question, which was at what point did you show them the book, and what was their reaction to it?
at different stages throughout. Yeah, I mean, all along, Johnny Veal was saying, document this. I want this to be a legacy. I mean, he was fearful that this would be the end of his life. So, I want something to be remembered by. Yeah, there's always a way that people, it's like the recording of yourself or the photograph of yourself. You're like, I don't look like that, or I don't talk like that. And you're like, well, I can play you the tape here. Yeah, but it's been a powerful experience. And I think in terms of what we hope to get out of this, which is more awareness, and the question of sort of expanding parole is a complicated one, but everyone wants some mechanism for people to have a second chance, everyone involved in the book. And so that's been very aligned too.
I think we're going to open it up for some questions. How do you want, do we pass a mic around, or?
Yeah, we'll repeat the
I'll
question.
repeat the question. And yeah, so if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand, and or stand up maybe. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if there's some difference between roles being granted for women versus men.
So the question was if Ben found any difference in paroles being granted for women versus men.
Yeah, so there are some very different aspects of incarceration for men and women. Many women are actually incarcerated in jails because there aren't as many prisons in a shorter time. Many women have also have domestic abuse issues and so on. There are fewer places to parole women than there are men. Halfway house is another thing, so that limits it. There's a woman in the book, Tara Lawyer, who I write about, who tells her story in California to a parole board. And she's also an extraordinary person. Yeah, I think there's both the storytelling that someone has to do, but there's also the self-repair and reflection that people have to do in order to get to the point where they can tell their story well. And I think that's also generally different for men and women, in the sense that a much higher percentage of women have suffered abuse who are in prison. And there's also a different kind of stigma. There's no, there's a sense of abandonment. Many more are parents, and even if men are parents, they're not sort of dinged for this, like you've abandoned your family. So there's a kind of guilt of also having to unpack and recover from this. In terms of how the boards respond, I'm not sure whether there's a sense of being more open to release or not, like what the statistics are. There are clear statistics about race, that more white people are released than Black and Latino people, and in many different states and across the country.
What role do you think fear plays in the terrible situation we got ourselves in, is one, and then there's the additional narrative of the people who were harmed by the two gentlemen that you tell their story about, and how do you as a storyteller stitch those stories together? Yeah,
it's a really great question. The first question was what role fear plays, and the second one was really about victims of crimes and how do I sort of address their stories and think about them. Fear is immense. I mean, that's what the sense of most of our policies are based on fear rather than any sort of logic or reasoning. That we would lock people away for irrational amounts of time after they're no longer threats to society. Almost all crime happens between the ages of sort of the middle to late teens and early and middle 20s. And so what does it mean then to lock people up into their 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s? There's a kind of like a rational fear that's part of it. Yeah, crime victims are also, one of the things I learned the most about in the book is sort of this history of the victims' rights movement, which sort of blossoms in the 70s and expands and then becomes a kind of like political football. But yeah, people who suffer from horrendous crimes is like it's devastating, and there's sort of there's like a dividing line of sort of before and after for many. So as a writer, telling those stories and being open to them, and at the parole hearings, you sit in this tiny little room in Illinois, and there would be the parole candidate's family, 5 feet here, and the victim's family's 5 feet here. They're in the same room together, locked in the same process. And one of the things I saw is how both parole and our so-called justice system fails crime victims too. 40 years later, 50 years later, these families of multiple generations are demanding more punishment. They feel no more healed or no more redressed than they did 20 years or 30 years or 40 years together. And the only option we offer them is to press that same button, more punishment. That's a failure of sort of repair. And maybe that's a kind of slant on it in a way of my own, but it's also, I could see it, how this system just did them wrong too. And it does them wrong in other ways. I mean, to have to come back, this is the arbitrariness of a parole decision too. It really is influenced by if a victim's family show up. How could that be justice, whether someone could make it in a snowstorm or not that day? How could that determine the outcome and that be justice? But they are, if this is what they believe they must have, they are sort of locked in this system of showing up every couple of years over and over and over again. Please.
What did you learn or didn't get a chance to learn about the inmates who have no chance of parole, where life is like, and they know they're going to die in prison?
Yeah, the question was, what about people who have no chance at parole, or there are 200,000 people who have no chance to get out? What about them? They're looking for ways. These are the guys who are advocating for reinstating parole in Wisconsin, who are thinking like, assess me now. And there are 200,000 people. It's not like we have 200,000 serial killers. We have tens of thousands of people who are convicted for felony murder, who are serving life sentences, which means they weren't an active shooter, murderer, whatever. They were affiliated in some way. And during this harsh time when we were doling out sentences, if you're even connected with someone, people are getting life sentences. And so, yeah, those people are, it varies. I mean, if we have 1.2 million people in prison, there's all kinds of folks, right? It's an entire city of a major city of people inside. So you're going to have all kinds of different people. I teach in a prison in Illinois called Stateville, and most of the guys in the programs are serving life sentences. And they are actively looking for ways to make their lives have value, have meaning, from taking a literature class to writing to then sort of, trying to find a way to get another sentencing. Yeah. Please. The question was about restorative justice, of thinking about in the same room you have somebody who committed a crime and the person or their family members and the family members of the people who are the victims. Is restorative justice the answer? Restorative justice is a process that tries to think about people who are hurt by crimes and think about a repair model. In some senses, it brings actual people together. It doesn't necessarily have to. There are other ways to do it. And there's a movement now to do more of this, and to think of it actually often as an alternative to some incarceration. Would you like to go through this process of restorative justice where you're answering, you're being held accountable, but you're not being kept separate. You're actually coming back. I talked about the 200,000 people who are never coming back. Those other million are coming back. Most people who go to prison are coming back within 5 years. And the question is, who do we want to come back in 5 years? What do we want that sentence to do? So restorative justice is a way to make people possibly in the community feel safer. On my podcast, thanks for the plug, some of my best friends are, ... We interviewed this woman, Daniel Serid, who runs a restorative justice program in Brooklyn. And she was told this incredibly powerful story of this mother whose son was victimized. And I'm going to curse. She said, fuck him, but let's go through this process because he's coming back. And, and she had an urge. She was like, I want to kill that kid, but I know he's going to be back in the community in 3 years, and I want to be able to walk around. So let's go through this process. Of course, that feeling happens. We feel that even when someone cuts us off in our car for an instant, like you can relate, like some irrational, but what after that? And so restorative justice, is it the answer? That's the other part of your question. That I don't know whether it could one, whether it could go to scale, and two, whether we as a country can embrace this. We're also such a violent country. We have so many guns. We have these other things where that, cutting off in traffic, we shoot one another. So the level of violence is pretty harsh. But it works. Daniel Serret, who runs this program in New York, there have been interviews with people who are victims of crimes who've both gone through the court system and then gone through restorative justice. And it's like, not even close, that people who are victims of crimes who go through restorative justice healing programs, approve much more of the process. So it is effective. In the back, please. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the question was, and I think pointing to an actual judge is here, what advice would I give, to somebody about sentencing? So one of the ways to think about reforms now of an alternative to parole, of saying, let's have a parole board do this, is to say, actually, let's have judges look at these long cases, these long sentences. Let's have a resentencing hearing. We took away, in the mass incarceration era, we took away discretion, the ability to make decisions by parole boards, and we also took away the ability to make decisions by judges. So we have mandatory sentences. Most judges don't have, their hands are tied. And like 95% of criminal cases don't go to trial. It's actually a DA, a prosecutor, who sets the terms. So there's another idea that we can create systems where judges get to make these calls now. Like let's take these 200,000 cases, and after 15 years, everyone should have a rehearing at least. They might not get out, but they should at least be seen. I think both make sense. I mean, I'm not answering the question exactly there, but I'm thinking about the roles of judges. Yeah, I said this before, but I think for all of us, this sense of what we've normalized, we have to keep on telling ourselves how abnormal this is. That we as a country, we're not like 8 times more violent. But we've come to accept these extremely long sentences and the certainty of a prison sentence as the right form of punishment. And, I think, probably most judges know that, but maybe not. I was at a parole hearing after I finished the book, and it was for Johnny Veal's co-defendant, who's older and who has zero gang involvement in his entire life. And the parole board started talking about, well, he has a 120-year indeterminate sentence, meaning he was going to come up for parole. He's now served 60. Or let's wait till 60. I think that because that's half. And they were saying these numbers, and I was sick, like actually got sick, viscerally sick, because I was like, they're saying these things that are like something out of the Old Testament. You know what I mean? We can't do that. I think we have to constantly check ourselves in those ways to think what this really means on a human level.
Okay, one
You
more
make the
question.
call, not me.
Oh,
I won't even look.
well, I saw the hand back here, the gentleman in the blue jacket first, so.
Yeah. So the question was about the prison system in Norway. Actually, for this book, I went to Norway to look at the prisons as I took a trip to Norway and Finland. And in Norway, from the moment somebody enters prison, it's about normalizing a prison sentence as much to make it as much like society as possible, because those people are coming back, and prison sentences are capped at 20 years. You can be held further if you're deemed unsafe, but they're capped at about, I think maybe it's 21 years. And from the moment somebody enters, it's focused on re-entry. So it's actually a true correctional institution. It's about corrections. I sat down with in a room with a guard and two incarcerated men, and they had a relationship like a mentor and a mentee, that it was the guard's responsibility to watch them and to ensure their success. And even the body language of seeing people in the prison, they were sitting like this, which you would never see. If you saw that in a US prison, someone would get in trouble because you think something, untoward, nefarious was going on. And I remember I went on this trip with other people who had been incarcerated and lawmakers and so on. And one of the men who was incarcerated in California started crying because he said, when I left prison, when I got out, the guard said, see you in a month, motherfucker. There was nothing about their relationship, which was, about success. We're a corrections institution. We don't celebrate this. We don't celebrate success. I mean, imagine it's like a school if everyone failed or something. And so the question then about whether we could do this, whether the guards in Norway have years of training, and they're trained as in psychology and sociology and then social work, so they're actually capable of doing these things. So there's an investment in the system and the people. The punishment is supposed to be taking away somebody's liberty, which we enshrine this idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of liberty. So taking away is a big deal, but we often say, well, that person doesn't deserve X, Y, and Z and so it's going to take a lot. One of the things that happened before, I'll wrap this up, but one of the things that happened before the midterms is that there was a kind of bipartisan look at this because it was so expensive to lock up people in. And maybe that's a way to lure more people in, that a system like Norway saves money in the long term because people don't go back. And the last thing I'll say is it's a much more homogenous country racially. And so a lot of this has to do deeply with our racism, and to see people who are locked up as human beings and equal, who deserve those kinds of rights. And you can imagine that in a country like Norway, or there somebody who is like you, that leap happens easier. We have to get past that in addition.
Big leap. Ben, thank you so much for your insights, your book. Everybody buy the book. Thank you for coming.